This is just a picture from the 18th century showing some people that are imbibing of the drug alcohol. You may remember, I think if you've completed your Chapter 5 quizzes, that I had a question about the 18th Amendment, the Volcker Act, which made alcohol illegal to purchase, to transport across state lines, and to sell in the United States from 1920 to 1933. So for 13 years, we were a dry country. So alcohol was then sort of like what we would think of as cocaine, or perhaps as marijuana used to be, was illegal. So what happened is people started to smuggle it into the country, particularly from Canada, where it was still legal. So that's where the drug organization under Al Capone was established, where he could make money by smuggling barrels of whiskey from Canada across the border. The roots of Prohibition actually sort of started in England, where people who beer drinking was accepted. You have to remember that in the 1800s, having beer, and even in the 1700s, it was actually kind of a caloric supplement for people. People worked very hard. They didn't always get enough calories, so sometimes the calories in beer would actually help people who were working very hard. But for the women, a man who would stop at bars or pubs in England before they came home, there was a lot of resentment that, of course, was brewing against them wasting their paychecks on alcohol and the family going hungry. So when we had immigrants coming to the United States, some of them brought with them this idea that alcohol should be associated with the devil and that it does nothing but ruin people's lives. These are some caricatures of what would be perceived as drunks. This guy, of course, no teeth, pretty rough-looking character. This poor woman here is kind of the lowest of the low. She's looking up, probably begging people for money to have a drink. So always portrayed as something that was very negative, and that kind of led to the movement, the temperance movement in the United States. What's interesting is when it was repealed in 1933, some of the people who were so against alcohol now had to have something to do, so they turned to marijuana. So it became, in 1937 is when marijuana in our country was, in a sense, it was officially made illegal, but they set it up so that it was almost impossible to buy it or have possession of it, because you had to have a special government sales tax, which nobody wanted to get because there were legal consequences of that. So it's interesting how once the temperance movement had to give up on alcohol, became legal in 1933 again, another constitutional amendment, within the next 4 years, their attention was turned to marijuana, and that's kind of how the strong prohibition against marijuana was established in our country, not necessarily based on science or anything like that. So things do, if you look at the history of things, you can get a better picture of how society viewed different drugs. This is just a picture of somebody having a great time at a party at night,
and this is what he's going to look like in the morning. This cartoon is showing the effects of a hangover. The pronounced headache, you can see here these little devils are sitting on his shoulders and they're pounding his head with a mallet. So when I talked to you on Friday about about hangovers, one of the things that people experience is these awful strong headaches from fluid shifts to the head and neck while you're sleeping, and that dilates these capillaries supplying the brain. This is what I've already gone over with you. This is an official sort of diagram showing you the reaction called fermentation, which happens naturally in nature. Remember that for your final, you'll have to know that what you need to have fermentation occur is some type of sugar source. So it could come from fruit, from berries, from vegetables, from grain. It's in some kind of a solution. You've got to add yeast to that solution. The arrow represents a reaction that is going forward. So the products of this reaction then are ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. Specifically, for every molecule of sugar that the yeast consume, they produce 2 molecules of ethyl alcohol and 2 molecules of carbohydrate. So some of you missed that question on Friday, what the products of fermentation are. You don't want to miss it again. That would be really kind of shooting yourself in the foot. So we're looking here at different kinds of fermentation products. We talked about wine, and I didn't mention too much wine coolers. They kind of caused a controversy about 10 years ago. A lot of people who begin to drink, particularly young girls, they have a kind of they don't care for beer. It's kind of bitter. They see it as more of a masculine drink. But a lot of young people began drinking by drinking wine coolers, which had a strong flavor, strawberry flavor, some of them, a lot of sugar added to them. So it was almost like these kids were drinking Kool-Aid. Well, wine coolers do have a lot of alcohol in them, 6% alcohol. So it wasn't that they were not, in fact, they were stronger in alcohol content than beer. There was a little bit of a backlash against that because it was like they were being marketed to kids who would like something that was very fruity and sweet, and maybe even thinking that it's not so bad alcoholically, had stronger alcohol content than a beer did. If you're looking at the different kinds of beers, you're just talking about how they might be processed, whether they're going to be a lager, a golden ale, or a dark ale, or you can add some in malt liquor. You carry the fermentation as far as you can without affecting the flavor, and then you can actually add alcohol on top of that. Light beer, usually going to be between 3 and 4% in the United States. That's often what people say you're actually getting in all of our beer. It often ranges between 3 and 4%. They're not that accurate in figuring out what percent alcohol is there. But the idea of light beer is that you remove the extra carbohydrates that are left over from fermentation. So you're still getting calories from the alcohol itself, but you're not getting those extra calories that come from carbohydrates that are left over. So it has a thinner flavor, a thinner consistency to it. And then, of course, you start distilling things. Just take anything you fermented. I hear someone talking. Is there a question? No? Okay. If you have a question, just raise your hand. I'll be happy to answer it. Whiskey, Scotch. Scotch gets a particular flavor from being stored in charred oak barrels. And some people who like Scotch like that distinct flavor. Scotch is something that, for me, gives me a very bad headache. I never can drink Scotch. Lots of congeners in Scotch left over from how it is stored in those charcoal-coated barrels. Then there's all kinds of liqueurs that are out there where you do add a lot of extra flavor. You can have almond added to a liqueur. Usually they're about 28% alcohol. For amaretto is an almond liqueur. Kahlua has a coffee-type taste to it. So it's all designed for people to have flavor added to the alcohol. And as you may recognize in San Antonio, we have some very interesting bars here. And we've had several bartenders that have made it to the national finals in terms of mixology contests. These are where you mix different beverages and to get a distinct flavor and uniqueness in how you garnish it. So there is actually an art to being a good bartender. Looking at the United States, much higher numbers here than any of the drugs we talked about. So when you start looking at how many people actually use these drugs, whether or not it's ever in their life, maybe experimentation, going to maybe using it in the last year or past month, maybe just social recreational, to people who are drinking every day, they could be considered heavy alcohol users, and people who are abusing alcohol. So remember, the definition of abuse is you continue your use despite negative consequences. So some people could be heavy drinkers, but theoretically, if they're not damaging their liver, which is kind of problematic, but they've never had negative consequences such as it impacting their personal relationships, their job, or having interactions with law enforcement, they're not actually an addict or abusing it. So this really laid out the striking evidence that not everyone who uses psychoactive drugs will become an addict. And this is becoming more and more predominant. I keep telling you 10 to 12%. So again, if 10 to 12% of this class, which was about 400, I think it's down to about 380 now, if you all drank, then 38 of you would be diagnosed, 10%, as an alcoholic at some point. So the whole key is what's the difference between those brains of those 38 and the rest of you. So, and it's true for all drugs. So I think our approach now is going to be different in this country, in our society. Once we understand that, can we focus more on that 10 to 12% and help them, as opposed to trying to use punitive measures to keep people from everyone from using a psychoactive drug by hoping that we can somehow save those 10 to 12%. This is just in Germany. You're looking at different countries here. These are a couple of young guys in Germany. If you've ever been to Germany during Oktoberfest, it's quite a disgusting display of overconsumption of alcohol. If you go down to the subways, it's like, oh my God, people have had massive amounts of beer. And the thing is, when you drink massive amounts of beer, you are getting so much liquid because it's not that concentrated. So people have asked me, how can a mug of beer have the same alcohol content as a little shot glass? Well, the difference is only 4% of those molecules are alcohol in the beer, whereas it might be 50% of the molecules are alcohol in the little shot. So it's how concentrated the alcohol is. When people consume large amounts of that fluid, if you look at these two guys, they're also kind of exhibiting sort of the bloated features that you see from people who are heavy alcohol drinkers. They are ingesting a massive amount of alcohol. Now, some of that is going to come out in urine, but some of it's going to be retained, particularly if you have any kind of salty food with that, like chips or peanuts or something like that. You tend to get this sort of puffy, bloated look because of your high consumption of fluids. And, of course, people get very intoxicated. You can be an alcoholic and only drink beer. It does not require you that you drink other kinds of alcoholic beverages. I went through with you how your body metabolizes alcohol. If you look inside a liver cell, it will take that molecule of alcohol, the enzyme in the liver cell called alcohol dehydrogenase, strips off a hydrogen molecule. That turns this into acetaldehyde. The next step is acetic acid, and then your cells can burn that. With a little oxygen, they burn it to produce energy. So you get about 100 calories from an ounce of alcohol. That would be maybe one shot or one beer. So if you're talking about watching your weight, if you're thinking about not light beers but regular beers, you've got 100 calories from alcohol, another 100 calories, maybe 130 from the carbohydrates in that rich beer. That's like a Snickers bar for every beer. So people that are consuming 12 beers, it's like having consumed 12 Snicker bars in terms of the calories that your body is getting. So over time, young people who have normal livers are going to gain weight from drinking because of men usually around the abdomen and women around the hips. That's where you're going to store those excess calories. I didn't ask you to know this particular enzyme. It actually is the enzyme that drug antabuse blocks. If you take an antabuse pill, it's going to inactivate this enzyme. You can't continue with this pathway, and you get a buildup of acetaldehyde, which people are usually going to find kind of uncomfortable, maybe nauseous, flushing of the face, red eyes. You don't feel very comfortable. It's kind of like a strong allergic reaction. I also said that, of course, you don't ever want to drink methyl alcohol. If this were methyl alcohol, this enzyme would turn it into formaldehyde instead of acetaldehyde. What's up? Okay? All right. So this is kind of what I just showed you, that little chart we had, going from 0 blood alcohol to half, which would be 0.5 blood alcohol content. This is where most people want to stay. A little lowering of the inhibitions. If you're a little bit shy, that can help. You feel relaxed. You're not so worried about your anxiety. Doesn't take long before alcohol begins affecting the GABA receptors in the cerebellum, which regulates your position in space and where your body is, so you're conscious, you can balance yourself. As the blood alcohol rises, you start to see more and more of these. When people are in a bar, they often don't recognize that they're beginning to have these effects. It's only when they get out of the bar and into another environment that they begin to feel their intoxication. In fact, some people say, oh no, alcohol is a stimulant for me. I feel like doing stuff. It doesn't make me feel like I should be sedated. Well, there are some things that are happening with alcohol. You do get that little rise in blood sugar. You can get, for many people, the loss of the anxiety, and that relaxation actually makes you feel more active in many ways. So you feel like you want to do things. People talk about, no, I don't get less coordinated, I get better. I can shoot pool or play darts better. That would be at the very low doses, where you maybe are relaxed enough to not have your mind interfere with what the sport is you're trying to do. But it is inevitable that you will lose your coordination as the night goes on. So as people who have lost their off switch and continue to drink, they're going to start getting into these kinds of situations. More and more loss of coordination, exaggerated emotions, unsteady standing or walking. Sometimes alcoholics will always hold on to something so people won't see that they've lost their balance. Remember, there's also behavioral tolerance. You kind of learn how to act straight because you're doing a drug in high amounts when most people aren't. So you're actually trying to cover it up. Many people will then exhibit this hostile behavior. The good judgment is gone. They mainly baser, childish behaviors often come out. Now you can't walk. You might be, in a sense, passing out. People can't rouse you. They can shake you and you still don't respond. Then you continue to drop into this unconsciousness. At this point, you may start to try and vomit as your body tries to save itself. That's why people shouldn't be on their back if they've passed out from alcohol. Then this continues until your blood pressure drops into the coma range. You're not getting oxygenation of the blood. You're not perfusing your organs, and you have a heart failure. So you're dying at that point. Usually if people die from alcohol poisoning or overdosing, it's either first-time drinkers, or if it's an older alcoholic, they have to really consume a lot. So Amy Winehouse was sort of in between. She did 2.5 bottles of vodka the day she died, so she was a small woman, so she probably had a blood alcohol level right up around here. So she wasn't using the hard drugs she had been using. She had been combining things like cocaine and amphetamines to kind of offset her drinking problem. But then when she went into rehab and they were testing her, she went off of they thought she was doing pretty well. They didn't detect metabolites of the cocaine or amphetamines in her system, but she just went back to old-fashioned drinking. And at that point, that's when she overdosed from alcohol. So she would probably be somebody, I would still say that she would be at the beginning ends, although she could drink a lot. 2.5 bottles of vodka at her body size was enough to kill her. All right, so we're looking at all how people can have, if they stay at those low-end doses, they're okay. People get some of these things here where you get dilation of your skin, you get a nice blush. I would say that if you have someone who is experiencing hypothermia, meaning low body temperature, don't give them alcohol. It makes them feel a little bit warmer because it causes the skin blood vessels to dilate, but they're actually losing more heat. So people on a cold day who drink alcohol to stay warm, they're actually accelerating their heat loss. So we're talking about that heavy long-term use. Again, most of you are not going to, if you are going to continue on in your life and be at some point diagnosed as an alcoholic, these things don't start showing up, usually the long-term health effects, until the second or third decade. So it's really when people get into their 50s that you really start noticing that there has been some kind of an effect. They look older. Their skin can look older. They've got spider veins from having those blood vessels dilated a lot. Some fair-skinned individuals, men, get a big red nose from the dilation of those blood vessels. The English and the Irish, particularly fair-skinned, can often get that. A person may also start having more and more erratic behavior because there actually have been some brain damage. They've lost a few neurons. They're blacking out a lot when they drink, which means that they're doing stuff, but they won't have any recall the next day. They may start to have problems with nerve fibers, usually in the periphery. They get a little bit spastic, real jumpy in their reflexes. Their liver starts to be damaged. their heart becomes inflamed. Mental confusion, delirium, loss of sexual behavior, impotence. We're going to talk about damage if a pregnant woman drinks during her pregnancy. It's called fetal alcohol syndrome. And at this point, CNS depression just meaning that people, they're really kind of exhibiting reduced cognitive function, and they usually will maybe have an early death. If it's, a lot of times it might be the liver, sometimes they have a heart attack. So there's a lot of toxic effects here from long-term use. Because it's legal in our country, you will see a lot more people exhibiting this. There's also genetics playing a role. Some people seem to be able to drink a lot more before they damage their liver. Other people are dead in their late 40s by cirrhosis or dead liver. So it really depends on other things that we probably don't really understand right now. So this is a liver that from an autopsy, this is not a normal looking liver. Your liver has multiple lobes, so it should appear kind of flaccid and soft. There's a few nicks here from the autopsy, but this liver looks like it's going to burst. This liver is showing the classic fatty liver syndrome. This is reversible. This just means that the liver is inflamed. If this person goes to the doctor, they're going to feel that their abdomen's tender. Your liver, of course, is right below your sternum here. The doctor will palpate your abdomen. His first question is going to be, how much do you drink? And at that, because he is noticing that it is your liver that's inflamed, what is happening here is irritated. It's constantly metabolizing alcohol. It has to store the calories from other foods until it gets the alcohol out of the way. And sometimes that fat is deposited right on the liver. Now, normally your liver is not a site where you would store fat. You store glycogen there, a form of glucose storage, but it wouldn't be fatty like this. So if the person stops, your liver will recover. If they don't stop, then they have a dead liver. This is an autopsy of a cirrhotic liver. All those little nodules that you see, those bumpy things, those are little pockets of scar tissue left when liver cells die. So they've just been, they've been going through, they've been burning alcohol. The liver became an alcohol burning engine in a sense, and it accelerated the death. This would be hard if you touch it, and because it's hard and knotty, the big vein that goes through the liver, the portal vein, gets constricted. So you tend to have fluid backing up trying to get through the liver. That fluid spills out of these distended blood vessels, and you get what's called ascites, or bloating of the abdomen. So it's a drum that's full of fluid because it can't really get through the liver. So people go in to have that drained periodically. So I had a friend who had nowhere else to go. I took care of him when he died of cirrhosis at my house through hospice. And I took him about 3 times to have his abdomen drained because it would get just tight like a drum. So he had just, he was probably, I think he had just turned 56, kind of estranged from his family. He'd been a sports photographer, a real charming guy, but a horrible alcoholic. And he was dying, so we kind of took him in, and it's pretty amazing how that fluid collects. And he had the classic look of skinny arms, skinny legs, and bloated belly, because when you're drinking like that, you're not getting any protein in your diet, so you start to lose the protein in your arms and legs. So it's not a particularly good way to go. You get very yellow from this buildup of metabolites from the liver. So cirrhosis, the more people who drink and the higher amounts they drink, will increase the number of people dying from cirrhosis. So if you look at 1911, out of 100,000, 17. During Prohibition, it did drop. So it's not that, during Prohibition, it's not that some people didn't stop drinking. The overall consumption of alcohol went down. The problem is if the goal was to have no one drinking, that's not going to work. And that's one of the problems when a drug is prohibited. If your goal is to have no one do it, that's impossible if you want to have any kind of a free society. If you want to have a society like East Germany, where the Stasi follow you everywhere and have microphones in your bedroom, yes, you probably could control drug use to have no one doing it, but no one at this modern age wants to live in that kind of society. So it popped back up. We had a pretty strong high. The 70s, 60s, and 70s were bad drug times for our country. We actually had more people there. With some education, cirrhosis has gone down some, but that 9% of 100,000, that's a lot of deaths. So it is out there. You will see it. This is just an enlarged heart on the right from someone who was a heavy chronic drinker. Stresses the heart gets big and flabby. A big heart is not a good heart. It actually doesn't pump as well. The ventricles get smaller. The chambers that hold the heart shrink as the heart muscles get bigger. This is just showing you a fetus, that there is a barrier called the placental barrier between the mother's blood supply and what goes to the fetus. And there is a barrier there called the placental barrier. But guess what? Yes, it will protect the fetus from bacteria and viruses and other things that might be in the mother's blood, but it is just like the blood-brain barrier. So any psychoactive drug, which is fat-soluble, will get across this fatty barrier just like it would for an adult. So psychoactive drugs have free access to the fetus from the mother's blood because this barrier is just like the blood-brain barrier. Psychoactive drugs get across. That's why they're psychoactive. Okay, so there are some conditions that occur when a pregnant woman drinks. You just need to know the top one here. We'll talk about it in our notes. It's called fetal alcohol syndrome. There are others where it's maybe not as pronounced, alcohol-related, fetal alcohol effects. These are all lesser things that can happen when a fetus is exposed to alcohol. But for us, we'll just look at the fetal alcohol syndrome. So it can be extreme. There are a lot of birth defects that occur because of a pregnant woman drinking. It is happening because there's high blood alcohol content while the fetus is going through specific developmental stages. When neurons are growing to get to sites of development where you've got formation of the head and neck. So this is an extreme case here. Here is a normal newborn that did die. They don't talk about the reasons here. You can see this is the cortex where we've got lots of folds, which would be normal. This is the brain from an infant who died at birth who was diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome. So the brain is smaller, and you notice that there are not as many folds. So there's those folds of the cortex that are where the higher functioning for humans are. It's folded like that so we can fit all that brain material into our heads. If you stretch this out, it would be quite a lot of material, but it's crunched up and folded so it can fit in there during development. So a smaller brain overall. Okay, these are two young boys in an orphanage in Russia. Russia had a horrible problem with alcoholism. Northern climates in general, those long, dark winters, are characteristic where more depression and more heavy drinking occur. It's interesting that in parts of Alaska and northern Canada, where there are those long, dark winters, you can also have a problem with extreme drinking. Now in Russia, they don't always mess around with beer. They will drink a lot of vodka. They make their own vodka sometimes. You go visit people and they have their own little slices of garlic in their vodka. Whatever they want to do is their regional thing. So the mothers of these young boys did do some heavy drinking. And they have the facial characteristics of someone with fetal alcohol syndrome. It was actually detected by pediatric nurses first, before doctors even noticed it. So if you're a pediatric nurse, you see hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of newborns. And they began to notice that newborns of women they suspected might be abusing alcohol had a certain look to their face. So this was was actually followed up with some research. And it actually occurs if you give a pregnant dam, a female rat, alcohol, her pups also have this characteristic facial features. So it is something specific to alcohol during development of the head and neck and closing off of the face. So usually if you look at the middle of the face, it tends to be smaller. So it's as if that middle area, the nose and the eyes are smaller. The eyes can be smaller and wide set, and sometimes there's extra folds of tissue at the inner eye and over the eye. The nose tends to be short with a big gap between the upper lip and the nose, and there's no furrow in the upper lip. So these are things that if you see infants all the time, you just start recognizing it. Now along with this, there can be intellectual development problems. So sometimes with extra help, these kids can catch up, but sometimes their ultimate cognitive potential is going to be less because alcohol was present during critical periods. This is a young man in the United States with his foster parents. He was also born with fetal alcohol syndrome. And so now his foster parents are taking care of him. He has some impaired intellectual development because of that exposure. Now you may notice that I haven't said this about other drugs. I haven't talked about people, you may not notice that you don't hear about crack babies anymore. If you were in this class in the 80s, late 80s, you would have heard crack baby, crack baby, crack baby, crack baby. It's interesting that you don't anymore. It was kind of a term that was sensationalized. It is true that mothers who use cocaine during pregnancy can have problems with, of course, they have high blood pressure, they can have problems of stroke, things like that. And the infants that are born were often very, very irritable, going through withdrawal after birth, because now when the infant's born, it's cut off from the drug supply, which it has become tissue dependent on. So it now has to go through withdrawal. Now with cocaine, there isn't the diarrhea, the cramping, and all the things you would get from heroin withdrawal, but you do have, as you know from your being in this class, that there is tremendous craving for the drug. Now the newborn cannot express this craving other than it's not going to sleep, it's going to be irritable, and it's going to cry. Maybe crying like 24 to 48 hours continuously, okay? Now people have improved. There used to be they would try and comfort these infants by holding them and cradling them. That's actually gets them more agitated. Now the treatment is to put them in a quiet place, to swaddle them with dim lights and no noise, and they seem to quiet faster and get through this period of withdrawal craving. But with appropriate care, they are not intellectually impaired, and they do not have physical abnormalities. The same is true for heroin. So what I'm telling you is drugs are specific. The difference is that alcohol is toxic. That's why you can use it as a disinfectant, okay? You can use it in a car engine like gasoline. So there are other things going on when alcohol is present in large amounts that are going to affect the fetus during development. So this is not genetic deformity. There's nothing, none of the drugs we've talked about are going to harm your DNA. They're not teratogenic, which means that there's damage to your DNA, which can happen with things like mercury and lead. This is happening because the fetus is developing in an environment where alcohol is present. So the DNA is normal, it's just being affected during development. So people have asked me, well, what about the father? What does an alcoholic father pass on? Well, the thing about alcoholism with men is that you do have reduced sperm motility and reduced sperm count. So you may actually be seeing reduced fertility in men who are heavy drinkers. Their sperm count will be lower. Now, there is a trend in families, because you know about how there is a certain inherited component to drug abuse, not specific to alcohol. So there is a type of alcoholism that seems to be passed from father to son. It involves early heavy drinking as young men, and so by the time they're 25, they've had a long list of run-ins with people and the law because of their drinking. That's a certain type of alcoholism. But for the men, it's just mainly reduced fertility. So if you're looking at the health effects, there are health effects here. We'll talk about specifically some of these fatal car crashes, fatalities, murders. In general, this is looking at where you will lose your license in different countries. If you look at Finland and Sweden, they don't mess around, because they have, Sweden and Finland being in the northern climate, they have a big problem with alcoholism. One time caught drinking, you just don't drive anymore. So you just lose your license and you rely on public transportation. As you may have noticed in the United States, there seems to be this unusual, or at least in Texas, you hear about people who have multiple driving while intoxicated. So one problem is they lose their license, but they do not stop driving because people cannot conceive of living without their car. And eventually people who get caught, who are heavy drinkers, because their behavior is so poor, their kind of miscues while they're driving just get worse and worse, where they are the kind of person who will be in multiple accidents because of their drinking. So this is just over a person's life. This is an example of how you have reverse tolerance. Here, there's the amount of alcohol you can handle, meaning you can still function. And as you are a heavy drinker, when you're young, you keep handling more and more as you get tolerant. About the age of a little past 30, as your liver begins to have some problems, you can handle less and less alcohol. So that's the term reverse tolerance. You know what I'm saying here. A couple drinks, as you lose your liver, you can't get rid of the alcohol and you have more effects. So that's sort of the graph that most people would see. Okay. Lots of graphs here. I usually don't ask you about those. So I'm going to ask you a quick question here. And I have to write it out here. I forgot to. All right. All right. I'm going to open this up. I'm just opened it up now. I've got that same problem here. It's saying it's got an unexpected out of bounds. Hang on. Thought I had that figured out. It's not open right now, but it is going to be 4%, 10%. Oh, it's beer. 4%, 10%, 20%, 40%. I had to shut it down because it had an error here. Let me go ahead and close it again. I still haven't gotten back from the company as to why that particular error is occurring. No, I had to shut it back down. Hang on. It's got to close it. Hang on. Try it one more time. Okay. It's still saying I have an error here. Okay. I'm just seeing 2 votes so far, so I don't think that. If you guys say it's working, I still registered just 2 votes. Well, I'm sure there's more people voting than 2 people, so I've got to stop it there.